You know, man, it's funny when you talk to someone like Cillian Murphy, you expect to get this deep actor's perspective. Some stuff about art, method acting, and his craft completely took me off guard. We were in the studio, lights were dimmed, James pulling up clips, and Cillian just starts talking about Islam. And not in a political sense, not in a controversial sense, but like on this deeply human philosophical level. And I remember sitting there thinking, wait, guys talking about humanity, compassion, and discipline in a way that modern society doesn't even come close to. You could feel it, man. Wasn't trying to convince anyone, he was reflecting. And I think that's what really hit me. The way he described Islam wasn't as a religion of restrictions or rituals, but as a structure built on understanding the human condition. And I realized, man, lost that in the modern world. We're so focused on comfort, progress, and technology that we've completely lost the sense of who we are. We've turned our lives into this endless cycle of consumption and distraction. People today are obsessed with validation, with being seen, liked, and followed. And yet they're more anxious, more lost, more disconnected than ever before. And when Cillian said that line, Islam understands humanity better than modern society, I swear there was this silence in the room. Hit me like a truth bomb. Because he wasn't saying it from a religious bias, he was saying it from observation. Islam, as he explained, recognizes that humans are not perfect. It accepts that we have desires, egos, impulses, and instead of denying those, it teaches how to manage them, how to align them with purpose. Think about that, man. That's deep. Modern society tells you to follow your desires, to do whatever feels good in the moment, to live your truth, even if that truth changes every week. But what happens when there's no discipline, no higher principle guiding that? People lose themselves. And that's where I started realizing that maybe, just maybe, the reason why so many people feel empty today is because we've removed a spiritual framework that kept humanity balanced for centuries. Cillian talked about prayer not as a ritual, but as a form of grounding. He said something like, when Muslims pray 5 times a day, they're not just worshiping, they're re-entering themselves. And dude, that blew my mind, because imagine 5 times a day you disconnect from chaos, from screens, from noise, and you remind yourself of purpose, humility, and gratitude. Who the hell does that anymore? We wake up and grab our phones before we even say, "Thank you for being alive." We scroll for hours before realizing we haven't looked at the sky in days. And here's a system, a lifestyle that's been reminding people for over 1,000 years to pause, reflect, and reconnect. That's not outdated, that's genius. The modern world treats discipline like a punishment. You talk about fasting, people call it too hard. You talk about modesty, people say that's oppressive. When you look deeper, Islam turns these things into tools for self-control and clarity. When you fast, you're not starving, you're training your mind to rise above desire. When you dress modestly, it's not about suppression, it's about dignity and intention. But we've twisted everything. We made excess a virtue. We made lust a lifestyle. We made greed the engine of progress. And then we wonder why anxiety and depression are sky high. Cillian said something I can't forget. He said, modern society preaches freedom but breeds emptiness. Islam preaches discipline and delivers peace. That's profound, man, because discipline isn't the opposite of freedom. What makes freedom meaningful? What's freedom if you're a slave to your own impulses? What's progress if it comes at the cost of your soul? And I think that's the part that really made me sit back and reflect. I'm not saying I suddenly converted or anything, but it opened a door in my mind, because when you strip away politics, media narratives, and stereotypes, what Islam represents at its core is balance. It's awareness. It's remembering that every choice has weight, every word has impact, and every day is a test. That's something our modern systems don't teach anymore. Built a world where people feel free to say anything online, but don't know how to sit quietly with their own thoughts. We chase pleasure, but we can't handle silence. We become so advanced in everything except in understanding ourselves. And that's what Cillian was pointing out, said that Islam acknowledges human weakness, and that's why it gives structure. You pray not because God needs it, but because you need it. Fast, not because food is bad, but because hunger teaches empathy and self-control. You give charity not because people are inferior, but because generosity heals the ego. These aren't just rituals, they're psychological training, man. It's like the oldest, most effective form of mental health therapy that modern society has forgotten. And I kept thinking, if you take an honest look at the West today, what do you see? People trying to fill the void with stuff. We worship brands. We idolize influencers, trade meaning for entertainment. We call it freedom, but it's really addiction. We've built a digital religion where likes are prayers, trends are scripture, and the algorithm is God, and no one's at peace. No one feels grounded. But when you meet someone who truly lives by faith, not just Islam, genuine faith, there's a calmness in their eyes that you can't fake. And that's what Cillian was describing. He said he saw that calm in Muslim communities, inner strength, that unity, that sense of belonging. It's like people aren't just coexisting, they're part of something larger than themselves. And man, that's what we're missing. We've got individuality, but no unit. We've got information, but no wisdom. We've got pleasure, but no purpose. And maybe, just maybe, the reason Islam still resonates so powerfully, even in the modern age, is because it hasn't abandoned those timeless truths about what it means to be human. And after that conversation ended, the host leaned back in his chair and just sat there for a while, letting the silence stretch out between the sound of the studio fans. You know, he said slowly, what he described keeps replaying in my head, the idea that faith, when practiced with awareness, isn't a cage. It's a structure that keeps you from collapsing in on yourself. He turned toward the camera, speaking now as if addressing every listener who had ever felt lost. We built a civilization that can calculate the distance to distant galaxies, but can't tell you why people feel lonelier than ever. Design devices that respond to a whisper, but we can't get our own minds to be still for 10 seconds. And yet that man talked about something ancient, something that asks you to pause 5 times a day and remember that you're not the center of the universe. He shook his head, almost laughing. That's not superstition. That's psychological engineering. Discipline, gratitude, reflection functions like an anchor. It doesn't stop the storms of life, prevents you from drifting so far that you forget where shore is. Modern culture teaches us to chase constant stimulation, but discipline teaches us to breathe inside the noise. The host remembered his guest describing the fast of Ramadan, the hunger, the patience, the empathy that comes from watching the clock tick slowly toward sunset. That, the host said, isn't about denying yourself, about understanding how fragile your impulses are. You see hunger and suddenly you understand the one who can't eat. Break the fast and suddenly food has meaning again. Tea brew. He told the audience that maybe the ancient systems weren't primitive. Maybe they were maps of the human psyche drawn before we forgot how to read ourselves. Our version of freedom, he said, lets us build anything, but it doesn't tell us what's worth building. Their version of discipline tells them why to build in the first place. He paused, tapping the table. When you live in a world where every emotion can be sold as content, every desire turned into a product, any faith that reminds you to look inward becomes rebellion. The guest's words had planted that thought like a seed. Remembered how the guest had said that the point isn't to dominate the world. The point is to master the self. Imagine, the host mused, if our schools taught humility the way they teach competition. Imagine if our cities echoed with people bowing, not to each other, but in unison toward a reminder that they all share one sky. He smiled sadly. Instead, we kneel to the glowing rectangle in our hand, i.e., spoke then about the paradox of progress, how every generation thinks it's the first to be enlightened while repeating the same mistakes. We broke every chain that tied us to meaning, he said, and then we called it liberation. But when you remove every boundary, you remove shape. A river without banks isn't freedom, it's a flood. Hebrew is. He leaned closer to the mic, voice dropping to a whisper. Maybe the old world understood that. Maybe that's why these spiritual systems survived for centuries. They offered limits, and within those limits they found peace. He quoted a line from an old philosopher. To be free, one must first know what to serve. Then he added, modern society serves appetite. The old path serves understanding. And the difference between the two is the difference between pleasure and peace. Brav the host took a breath and laughed quietly. You know what's wild? Every time we think we've outgrown faith, we reinvent it in some digital form. Meditation apps, minimalist living, digital detox. These are echoes of ancient practices we once dismissed. It's like humanity is trying to remember something it forgot. Said the guest had mentioned how real spirituality is like exercise for the soul. You don't do it once, you train every day. That's what those daily prayers are. The host said, reps for the heart. He described how after the show he'd looked up stories of people who found calm through that rhythm. Scientists, artists who had lived chaotic lives and suddenly discovered peace in structure. They didn't become less creative. He said they became focused. Discipline sharpened their chaos into purpose. Dubbert. He reflected on how modern people mistake noise for meaning. We measure life by how full our schedules are, but emptiness has its own wisdom, he said. Stillness is the moment when you can finally hear yourself. Talked about walking home that night, city lights humming, and for the first time noticing how beautiful silence felt. Maybe, he whispered, this is what he meant. Maybe understanding humanity isn't about analyzing it, it's about remembering it. Brew. He ended the segment quietly. We've tried everything. Money, fame, distraction, none of it fills the hole. But structure, gratitude, prayer, those might not be old relics. They might be the medicine. Maybe the ancient heart knew what the modern mind forgot.